And officially welcome you all to Advancing Health Equity Training here with Health Resources in Action via the Community Health Training Institute. My name is Gina San Inocencio. I use the she, her pronouns, and I serve as the Associate Director for CHTI, which is what we call the Training Institute for short. Welcome, welcome. You are here for one of our free trainings. In fact, all of our trainings are free because of the generous funding through the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. So we welcome you if this is your first training, and happy to see you back if you've attended our trainings before. We've got a few more for the rest of this fiscal year, and encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't already. And we're excited to have you here and to get officially started. If you have not been to our trainings before, we try as much as we can in this Zoom world to keep it as interactive and engaging as possible. So I invite you to share your thoughts, questions, comments in the chat box, as well as out loud. And yeah, bring all your experience to today's training, and I will hand it over to our tech lead, Victoria, to say hello and introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Victoria. I'm the administrative coordinator at CHTI, so I'll be running tech today. So feel free to chat me if you have any questions or anything. But I'm really excited to be here with you all today, and I'll pass it over to the trainers.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. Erica Gaitan here. We're going to do some intros in a second, but maybe we can just go to the next slide, Victoria, to do some housekeeping pieces. So as Gina mentioned, you're here for Advancing Leadership in Health Equity. Please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat. I really love seeing where folks are dialing in from, what they love about their places. And we'll keep on learning about our colleagues in that way. And just a couple of ways to engage today. We know it's a Friday morning and that you could be doing a lot of different things with your time, and we're really grateful that you chose to be here with us today. But please, we want to encourage you to take care of yourselves and do what you need in this time. It's a long training. If you need to get up, you need to stretch, look away from your screen, we welcome you as you are and are grateful that you're here with us. So in the next slide, we talked about just a few ways to engage. We can go back one. Gina mentioned this, but we love to engage folks. We want to encourage you to use the Zoom chat feature like many of you are doing right now throughout. If you want to ask questions, if you have reactions, we love, emojis, anything that you want to give us. There's also the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen if you want to enable closed captioning. As Gina mentioned, this is a free training, and at the end of this, we'll have a poll and a survey to get your feedback so that we can continue to improve and also think about how we offer these free trainings in the future. And lastly, we'll be sending out these slides post webinar. I know we have 3 hours here and we have a ton of information to cover. And so if you don't get everything, we will be sending out the webinar recording and also the slides post webinar. All good with folks? Awesome. I see some nods. So who are we? The next slide, Victoria. So my name is Erica Gaitan. I use the she, her pronouns, and I am the associate director and one of the associate directors at Health Resources in Action. A few of the hats or identities I bring into this space. I've been in the public health field for 10 years now, and have had the opportunity to work with health departments, state governments, community coalitions, and a whole host of other groups that have really fulfilled me in these last 10 years. And prior to that, I am a social worker. And so I've been in the field of social work for a long time, and I'm a youth worker specifically. And so young people have a special place in my heart. And we also show up in this space with different identities. And so just to give you a little bit about who I am a Mexican American, proud Latina. I am a queer person, and I wear a lot of different hats within HRIA as a manager and a team lead. And so those are some of the identities that I bring into this space, and I'm really grateful to be able to share those with you. So Demetrius, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. Hey, everyone. I'm Demetrius Buras. I'm a senior manager here at HRIA. I work in capacity building assistance. And I've been at HRIA for a little over 2 years now, and in the grassroots nonprofit space for about 13 years before then. During that time, I attended CHTI webinars and trainings. So it's really fun and cool to be on the other side of the screen. And fun fact, we had a pretty big all staff meeting yesterday, and Erica shared a lot about her history in doing this work. And it was really exciting to hear, and I'm really excited to co-present alongside her today. Some of my identities that I'm bringing into the space. I'm a cis white man. I'm also a manager, I'm a supervisor, and the way that those identities intersect, and I'm really intentional about trying to prop up and support the folks that I supervise and the teams that I work on as best as I can. So those are some of the identities that I bring into the space. And I'm just really excited to be here with you all. So if we can go to the next slide, we're just going to run through the agenda. So we're going to start with some level setting. This is really just an opportunity to build some shared language as we move through today, and to contextualize power in particular, actually, because a lot of the topics that we're discussing are going to be vulnerable. And the things that we're talking about as far as change within organizations have to do with power, both from all levels. So we're going to be starting with that for level setting, and then we're going to talk specifically about the power of lived experience and the value of it all. From there, break. I know it only appears here on the agenda once, but we do have more than one break for you all. We know it's a Friday, it's a longer training and stuff, so we're going to be intentional and try and give you all as much time as we can throughout the day. But from then, we're going to move into building power within organizations. And so what this is going to look like, it's going to be a lot of tools, examples, stories from what we're trying on here at HRIA. And I use the words trying on very intentionally because there are things, some of them are things we've been doing for years. Some of them are things that are kind of newer, and we're still figuring out what they look like. And then from there, a little bit of time in skill building. And it's going to be individual work, some breakout rooms and group work, all the way throughout the day. So lots of different styles of learning are going to be able to enjoy it. Next slide, session goals. So these are the goals for today. You all probably read these a little bit in the description, and we did adjust slightly based on the feedback that we got in the registration form. So we're going to really identify the value of lived experience in systemic dynamics of power and oppression, gain strategies to build power and have courageous conversations within an organization, and then learn tools for assessing power and identifying allies to advance equity within these organizations. Okay. And so ways of being, this is something that we try to incorporate in all our trainings. It's really important, especially when we're having these conversations around power, where we're talking about having courageous conversations and where some people may choose vulnerability. We don't want anyone to feel forced into that decision, but we do know that some people may choose that today. And so we really want to honor and respect the courage that takes. So here are some ways of being. It's a non-exhaustive list. And I'd also be happy to have folks come off mute and read some of these if they would like. So I'll give it a few seconds. But please, as I'm reading through these, if you have stuff to add, whether it's to any of these in particular or other ways of being and norms, these are also sometimes called group agreements. If you have others that you'd like to add, please drop them in the chat. And we're going to come back to this throughout the session. But so some of them, we're all teachers and learners. What does that mean? It's really an embodiment of that lived experience kind of value. Erica and I are here, and we're going to be sharing a lot of information, but it doesn't mean that we're the only ones who know about these things. Each of you bring your own experience and are here and can also share that. We really encourage that. And we're also all learners. So just as you all are hearing from us, Erica and I are here to learn from you. And in the breakout rooms, we hope that you can share and learn with one another. Please be mindful. Body, spirit, emotions. If you need a bio break, take it. If you need to refill that water, if you need to stretch, if you need to step away because you did just share something vulnerable and you want to take a moment to just breathe, that's obviously totally okay. Moving into asking ourselves, to wait. Why am I talking? Why aren't I talking? This is also sometimes called step up, step back. And it's really just noticing your level of engagement. If you're someone who normally does sit back, maybe it's because you just need a little bit more time to process and think about stuff. That's okay. And we want to encourage folks to move into the space where they do feel comfortable to share. We have intentionally built in some individual reflection time ahead of breakouts to facilitate that. And if you're someone who normally jumps in kind of frequently, please just make a little bit of space. Obviously, we still want to hear your voice. We still want you to share. But if the breakout room is for 10 minutes, make sure you're only speaking for a few of those minutes and that others in your breakout room also have time. You can always pass or pause. Again, this is that piece about vulnerability and it's being a choice. Courage being a choice. We don't want people to feel too uncomfortable in the space, but we want to make a space that can hold that as well. Challenge by choice, but do challenge yourself. Going back to that same thing, I don't want to spend a lot of time, but I think it speaks for itself in the context that we've already set. And then sharing responsibility for accessibility and belonging. This is really just making sure that slowing down a little bit. I started speaking kind of fast because I was trying to get through this, but it's slowing down. It's speaking kind of clearly. It's increasing the volume on your own computer if you're having a hard time hearing, and going from there. I know that was a lot. I see some comments in the chat about how these are great. And leaning in when we're uncomfortable. Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone have anything to add to these? And again, this isn't your only opportunity. You can add throughout. Seeing none, hearing none, I think we can move to the next slide. So, quick community builder, because we talked about who we are, but we also want you to be able to talk about who you are and get to know one another. So in a few moments, we're going to send you off into some small breakout rooms, give you all a few minutes to introduce yourselves, name, organization. You can choose to share your pronouns. Don't take a ton of time, but maybe this is also an important opportunity to share some of your identities that you're bringing into the space. And sharing an appreciation for yourself is going to be the icebreaker question. And this is really intentionally designed to kind of challenge the traditional narrative around feedback. A lot of people's relationship with feedback is often one of power over, and we'll go into power over and what that means a little bit more later in the training. But it's often power over. So feedback being delivered to you and it's something constructive, right? It can be very productive. But can also sometimes be critical, make us feel a certain type of way. So sharing an appreciation for yourself is a way to change that relationship with feedback, really disrupt the power dynamic around it. And also, it's important to be able to give yourself that pat on the back. Know that it's a Friday, you're jumping into this training, and you've already put in a good week of work doing incredible work in your communities. And it's important to recognize and acknowledge that and appreciate ourselves. So we're going to send you all off into breakouts and see you back in a few minutes. Erica, did you have anything to add?
No, that's great. I'll just say that we have about 5 minutes in breakout. So this is just a quick intro to yourself. And as Demetria said, we don't spend a lot of time appreciating ourselves. And so this is a moment for us to really think about that, give ourselves our flowers, and get to know your colleagues because there's so much wisdom in this space. Thanks. And I hope you all had a good time meeting your colleagues and also giving yourself an appreciation. We have in the chat, it was slightly uncomfortable to share an appreciation for myself. Totally, Rachel, we got that from a few folks too as they were coming back. And we think it's really important. I don't know, Demetrius, if you want to say what you said about feedback or reflections.
Yeah, absolutely. And so appreciations are just another form of feedback, right? Like I think that I am speaking to the choir here, but anytime we're working with our teams or in any other organizations, people are always saying we want more feedback. We want to talk about feedback more, sharing discomfort around feedback, whether it's positive, negative, constructive, all the things. But the work that a lot of us do is really hard. it takes a lot out of us and we put a lot into it. And so it's really critical to kind of give ourselves those kudos and give ourselves those appreciations, because it's a practice that sustains us, right? It's wellness, and it's professional development, and it's all those wonderful things that we all aspire to. And we can't really change the narrative around power unless we really talk about the narrative of like communication with one another and even our self-talk. So it's just a really great way to have some positive feedback and feel good about yourselves on a Friday.
Thank you. I see in the chat. I'm going to try and start every day by sharing an appreciation for myself. I love that. Awesome. All right, so now we're going to go into a little bit of the content, but first we wanted to make sure that folks are on the same page with some level setting and the language that we're using. And so in equity work, you know, the first piece is really thinking, how am I showing up? What are the terms that I'm using? And are the folks that I'm working with, do we understand those terms to be the same? And so we're going to just spend a few minutes talking about some shared language. In the next slide. So first, equity, right? It's all over the description. We hear it a lot. And when we're thinking about equity, we're really using just a few definitions. There's a ton out there, but the one we want to offer today involves creating fair conditions for everyone, acknowledging that different people have different needs. You may be familiar with this graphic on the side. There's a lot of different graphics that are similar. But sometimes equity can look like redistributing resources on that picture down in the left. It could look like adding resources or even adapting resources. But really, I like to think of it as fixing it up. And what I mean by that is when we talk about diversity, a lot of times it's like who's in the space and we're trying to mix it up. And equity is really thinking about acknowledging that people have different needs and we're trying to fix it up, right? And so that's a good distinguisher that you can use as you're thinking about your work. We also talked about lived experience in the description quite a bit. And what do we mean when we say that? And so for lived experience or living experience, it is the sum of an individual's past events and personal history with navigating systems of power through their different identities, through their different marginalized or oppressed identities or backgrounds. One example I like to lift up here of what does that actually mean in our work. At Health Resources in Action, we run a substance use helpline where folks from all over the state can call in and get some resources. And a lot of the folks that we have answering those calls, working with folks one-on-one, have that lived experience of being someone in recovery or someone with a closer personal connection to substance use. And so we know that that takes a level of empathy, of skill. And so their lived experience is really critical in that work, just like a lot of your lived experience is critical in the work that you do. So on the next slide, you'll also hear me and Demetrius share a lot about policies and practices. Sometimes those can be used interchangeably, but they really are different. And so when we're thinking about policies, those are really the institutional, organizational rules or regulations or the priorities that really guide entities' work. Those are those formal thinking, and we're thinking about like government or policies, and we sometimes refer to that as like big P policy. And then we also talk about practices, right? And practices are more of those informal shared habits, the procedures that we do, how we are with each other that compromise our work to support or not support systems. So those are two differences. Demetrius, I want to ask you if you want to talk about any of these definitions.
Yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about the relationship between the two as well. And that's just to say that just because a policy is created and made doesn't mean that it instantaneously becomes a practice, right? So policies can come into play, and there's things that everyone within an organization, within a team, really need to then make a habit. And then there's also the converse. Just because there isn't a policy for something doesn't mean that people within an organization, within a culture, don't already have a practice around it. I think a really great example that kind of contextualizes this is sick time as mental health time. right? So some organizations could have a policy that your sick time can 100% be used for mental health days. And maybe that's a practice some people lean into more than others, but it's really important to be able to encourage that amongst our teams. And some organizations might not have that as an official policy written down anywhere, but it is common practice that supervisors encourage their supervisees to use their sick time as mental health days. So just adding that piece of clarifying context that the two aren't congruous, and also kind of establishing the importance that even though there may be an established practice, again, using that idea of like sick time for mental health days, it's also important to kind of codify that and make it policy, because it helps give it that extra level of legitimacy and that extra level of encouragement.
Thanks, Demetrius. So now the next slide. We have started talking a lot about these concepts, and where we would be remiss if we didn't start talking about all of these things in relation to power. And so we're going to start this section with a little bit of a temp check. And on the next slide, we want to know, what are the first couple of words that come to mind when you think about power? So I'm going to give folks about a minute to drop your thoughts, but we're going to spend some time thinking about power. And I want to know what comes to your mind when I say that word. Control. Yep. Privilege, misuse, authority. Hard to change, inequities. Pervasive. Decisions. Imbalance, struggle. Authority, voice. Ability to affect change. Yeah, an agenda. Thank you all so much for sharing. I think this is really resonating with a lot of my experiences with power and sometimes the negative connotation that comes to it. We're going to be talking about the different expressions of power, but a lot of what I'm seeing in the chat is about that more traditional approach of hoarding power and perfection and productivity and all of the pieces that we think about of struggle and inequity. A lot of abuse and oppression is what I'm seeing in the chat. And that's totally valid. And today we're going to spend some time thinking about how we're reframing and looking at power. And we're going to start with some definitions to offer today. So in the next slide, here are two definitions of power that we want to offer. And I want to invite somebody who feels compelled to maybe be able to read that first definition of power. So whoever would like to read.
I will.
Thank you.
Power definitions. Power, properly understood, is nothing but ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. Dr. Martin Luther King.
Thank you so much. So here I want to point out the ability to achieve purpose is really what I was thinking about when we put this on the slide. Who would be able to read the second definition?
I'll jump in. Good
Thank
morning, everybody. Power is dynamic, relational, and multidimensional, changing according to its context, circumstance, and interest. Its expressions and forms can range from domination and resistance to collaboration and transformation. And that's from Raji Hunjan and Jethro Pettit from Making Change Happen.
Thank you so much, Astrid. So how do those definitions sit with folks? Like, what stands out to you? What do you agree or disagree with? You can either drop in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself, but I'm really curious how these land with folks.
Well, the first thing that pops into my mind is that the way we define anything is related to our current state of consciousness about that particular issue. So I don't know if you all know what I'm talking about, but whether we're in a victim mentality or otherwise, the way we perceive anything is through the lenses that we have. And those lenses are defined by our life's experiences and our ideologies, and consciousness.
Mm,
So when we're above, hovering above a situation, we're not in it, we can perceive all of the machinations, everything that's happening. And we might even be able to understand in a way that's detached from judgment or categorization. Oh, no wonder they do it that way. But sometimes when we're in it at a lower kind of consciousness, we might feel like the victim, or we might want to hero someone. So it all depends on consciousness. For me, that's how I name it for myself.
yeah, it's beautifully said, Astrid. And that really resonates with that second definition you read of how power is dynamic, relational, and multidimensional, right? Each of us come with our different identities. Demetrius and I shared a little bit about that, about the identities we bring in this space. And sometimes we have more formal power, sometimes we have less, depending on what identity we're bringing and what hat we're wearing at that time. So thank you for those reflections, Astrid. Anybody else want to share how these definitions land with them? In the chat, Diane said the ability to achieve purpose. Yes. Thanks for that affirmation. More comments on the chat. Power can have a positive impact or a negative impact depending on who is in power. Totally. Well, thank you all for sharing. So now we know what power is at its baseline. We want to talk about a little bit about how power shows up. In the next slide. This visual is a little blurry, but what I really wanted to show you here as we move from left to right on this visual are the different expressions of power, starting with power over. And a lot of what you all were saying in the chat about, dominance or inequities or struggle, this is where the power over piece comes in, and what we traditionally think of dominance, right? It forces rigidity and hierarchy. It really has that power to control over. And so we see that as the traditional experience of power. And what we're trying to do is move across this visual. When we think about power too, that's really where we start thinking about the ability of all people to exert their influence, right? Every person or a group has the potential to make change. As we keep going, we have power with, and this is where it starts becoming more of a strength based on mutual support and with solidarity. This is where a group of people can really, with a common goal, who are supporting each other, work to make change happen. And then finally, we have the power within. And that's really a person's capacity to imagine, to have hope and persevere, the power that's within ourselves and with all of us. And we don't spend a lot of time in the power within section, which is what we're going to do in our next activity. But in this visual, we also have power for, which is the larger goal and impact. You don't see that in a lot of visuals for expressions of power, but I wanted to add it in there for folks to think about. But what I want you to take away from this graphic is really two pieces. There's a lot of ways to express power, but when it comes down to it, if you can go to the next slide, Victoria, there's either a power over approach, what we think about in those traditional spaces where power is finite. There's only a little bit of power, and those who have it, they must fear it, they must protect it, they must hoard it. And if you look at that visual, some of you may be familiar with this visual from community organizing spaces, but power over is really that big fish trying to eat all those little fish, right? But when we flip the script, we want to start working and having power with. And when we think about power with, it's really expansive when it's shared with others. All of us have power within ourselves and within our place and influence, and it's really infinite. And so the moment we start thinking about the power with and how we are working together is really when we can see change. So going back to that visual, now we see a bunch of the tiny fishes. When they've banded together, they can, be on equal footing with that larger fish. And so power with is where we're going to spend our time. And here is we're going to introduce you to our first tool. As Demetrius mentioned earlier on, we're going to cover a lot today. And so we wanted to offer a lot of different tools, a lot of different frameworks, because we recognize that all of you are working in different contexts, and what may work for us may not work for you. So we're hoping to give you just an overview of a few things to try on. And so this is the Power Wheel activity that we wanted to share. And this was created by some of our colleagues at Equity and Results as they're thinking about results-based accountability and what that means for their work. But this is just a prompting guide to start thinking of the different powers that we have within ourselves that we usually don't take into account. And this has been a really excellent tool to be able to do individually and as a team. And so we want to encourage you to think about how you might use this tool. But I'm going to walk through it first of some of the powers that we have within that we may not think about as we're navigating our different spaces. And so the first is cultural power. What is your heritage, your resilience, the cultural assets you bring to the space? Next is the people power, right? Who do you relate to? Who do you know? Who's your network? Then we move into some of the political power, and that's more of formal authority. What's my power within my organization, within my formal role? We have economic power, and those are those material resources that you need to wield and bring to the space. And then your inner power. What know-how, skills, or energy or experience do you bring? And then I know there's a lot of others, but this tool is just a visual of some of the ways that you can start thinking about the different powers. I'm curious if folks have any they want to add before I model how you might run through something like this with your team. All right.
You know, something that's popping into my mind that for me is, and I know it's not always apropos to bring into circles of work, but spiritual power, spirit within that I see in every individual, that I know is within me, and that the collective of humanity has. There's so much power in the unseen that we're not really putting and channeling into that oftentimes we don't. I won't make a general statement, but that's power of spirit, of our soul, that for me is a part of this.
I love that, Astrid. I feel like we should add that to this wheel, because you're right, it's not often talked about, and it's such a central component of who we are and the powers that we bring. So thank you for adding. Does anyone else want to add?
I just want to add, I know it's silly, but I have a poster or sign that I had made that's on my wall in my office, and it says, "What is your superpower?" And I think it connects very closely with the spiritual, you know, but also just trying to help people feel powerful.
Yeah, your superpower. I love that, Diane. And you're right, it does tie into the spiritual piece, and it speaks so much about the inner, the unseen, the powers that we have, and our superpowers. Sometimes I think about that as like leaning into our genius, right? What does it mean when we're leaning into our genius? And so now I'm going to show you what that could look like, and you're going to have some time to practice and do this on your own quietly. But on the next slide, these are the same questions that you just saw in the visual, but I put them in slide format here so that you can hear it and as I walk through the example. And so this, you know, you spend a lot of time thinking about this as an individual and as a team. And something that I might share from myself is, you know, I'll start with cultural power. And so I am bilingual and bicultural. That means that I can navigate different spaces and with different folks. And I really think that that's a cultural asset that I bring to this space. For people power, I mentioned that I'm a social worker. I have a big network of social workers, especially across Massachusetts. and they really help me as I network and navigate my way through equity work. Political power. I am an associate director in my organization, and so that means I have proximity to power in a lot of spaces because of the tables that I sit at, the policy making power that I have. You know, I can have some ability to control like budgets and teams, not that much, but you know, a little bit, and I need to recognize that political power that I have. And lastly, inner power. So I think that I'm a good listener. I bring a lot of experience in the research and evaluation field, but most of all, my inner power. I feel like I bring good vibes to a space, and I think that's really critical. And so that's me reflecting on these different buckets. We may not have it for every single one, or may not want to share about that, but it's important to interrogate ourselves a little bit and take note of what we're bringing into spaces and how we're showing up. Once you've done that, another question I like to ask myself is, when do I feel the most powerful? And that can be a space, a time, a location. And I'll say that when I feel most powerful, it's really when I'm in intergenerational spaces. I come from a long line of very strong women. And so being with younger women, with older women in my family is really, I feel the most powerful in that space. So that's a little bit of how you might model this tool, how you might use it. And I really want to encourage you all to think about how you can bring it into your context and your space as you're thinking about your work. And so for the next couple of minutes, if you're an introvert like me, you need some time to process, and we're going to give you a little bit of that individual reflection time so that you can take a look at this wheel and just take note of what's coming up for you. Where do you feel your superpowers are, like Diane mentioned? And then when we come back, you're going to drop in the chat just some ideas of how you can use this tool or your activity. So we're going to put the slide back on the power wheel so that you can have that visual, and I'm going to play some music. Victoria will be putting you in excuse me, we're not doing breakout rooms, but feel free to turn off your camera, listen to some music, and we'll give you the signal when it's time to come back. You'll have about 3 to 5 minutes to just individually reflect on what your powers are.
All right, I'll jump in. So one of the pieces of work we do is I'm a partner, the West Warwick Prevention Coalition is in partnership with one of the health equity zones that's located locally in our town. And they serve a population of folks that are at this time without housing. And the thing that I keep bringing forward is the ways in which our organizations that are all partners, we're assistive, we're helping organizations. So the lens through which we're talking about people with substance use disorders or who are experiencing homelessness is only and primarily through the lens of what do they need? What do they require, right? It's always a lack-based perception. And what I long to do is to invite those folks to share what they know, to share what they have to contribute, so that we're looking at them from a strengths-based perspective, that every human being has something to offer. Yes, we all go through our doldrums, but even in the worst moment, or worst, put that in quotations, there's something to be gained from learning from someone. So I'm thinking about this could be a really nice way to invite people, everyone, anyone, to think about how they contribute, the ways in which they do have power, that they're not always just in need of something.
Yeah, I see a lot of nods, a lot of emojis in the chat. Astrid, it seems like that's resonating with folks. And I love that piece about the deficit oriented. How are we switching from that to be more asset oriented? And sometimes it's just giving the space for people to think and try these things on and share. So thank you for sharing. I see some things in the chat. Nancy, you have your hand raised. Anything you want to add?
Yes, we do. One of my roles is to provide the staff of our agency the tools to to do their job, to just provide that level of support. And there's a lot of lived experience professionals, peer professionals of different different categories in our agency, from mental health to substance use disorder. And I really see this perspective as being a useful perspective for people on the care teams who are more elitist or degree focused, who we're trying to help see the role of the peer, the lived experience person as an expert in the team versus somebody to make coffee or copies.
Thank
So
you, Nancy.
these tools are good for that.
Thank you so much, Nancy. And I hope I'm not pronouncing your name wrong with Sadie.
Yes, Sadie or Sadie are both okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Let me just try to turn my camera off so that you're not talking to a blank screen. I think that one of the things that I apologize for probably the negativity that would be in this statement. It has been quite the year so far. It already feels too long. I think one of the things that it brings up for me is how there cannot be effective, or I don't think there can be an effective change or long-lasting change without all the types of powers that are listed here. And I feel very discouraged, especially this week, because they continue to be very siloed. I see them to be very segregated, and there is a lack of collaboration within the spaces that are trying to enact change, that it continues to feel impossible to actually make the change that we want to see for people. And then the piece that I find, at least what has set me off in this week is last week's court ruling about that Texas kid that can be suspended from school over his hairstyle. I don't even understand why we are using court resources in this country about a kid's hair.
Yeah.
But that is the reality we're living in, unfortunately, and I think I'll end it at that.
Yeah. I really appreciate you speaking that into this space, right? It's so discouraging sometimes what's happening in the world. There's a lot of heaviness, and you're right. There is a place and a purpose for all of these types of powers. And it's about how are we sitting with them? How are we thinking about them? And eventually trying to collaborate in an activity we're going to do later about trying to assess where our influence is, where our power is, and trying to get to that place where they're each working together. So thank you. I appreciate those remarks. And others in the chat, a lot of people thinking about, I have certain powers in certain sections. I can use this tool within my coalition. Demetrius, is there anything you want to add there?
Just from the cultural stance and piece of this all, Insight, I really appreciate you bringing that into the space as well. I think that, and others are saying this in the chat, commenting on how they want to bring this type of conversation and this tool to their teams. And I really think that that's one of the biggest tools and pieces of power that we have available to us in this virtual space, to take a lot of the conversations and tools that we're going to be talking about today back to our team, so that they can then bring it back to their friends and communities. Because it's, the power of community is like one of the greatest tools that we have available to us to make some of this change. But it is tough out there. It is tough out there. I just want to also bring people back to our ways of being from the top. Like, please take care of yourselves in the space today. We know that these conversations around power are needed and fuel for the work, and they can also feel depleting at times. But really appreciate everyone's opening up in this conversation.
Awesome. So we've been talking at you for a long time, and we want to really lift up the knowledge, the wisdom, all the brilliance that's in this space. And so in our next piece, we're going to do some small group discussions by choosing your own adventure. And so Demetrius, you want to set us up for that?
Yeah, thank you so much. We can actually jump ahead to the next slide as well. We are moving into the power of lived experience kind of section of the agenda. And just to preview a little bit, we're going to be doing some group discussion. And after this, you all are going to be going on break. We did promise you breaks. I want to make sure that you know that we are holding ourselves true to that. So for the next slide, and again, the way we're going to do this is going to be making space for individual reflection first. So there are a few different questions here. No pressure to answer them all. No pressure to answer a specific one. It's really, truly a choose your own adventure. So we're going to take 5 minutes. This is going to be individual time to reflect on any and all of these questions that folks want to reflect on. And then from there, everyone's going to go into breakout rooms. You'll have some time in there, about 15 minutes, to discuss with one another, to share. And I'll remind you of this before we actually send you off to breakout rooms, but we really want to encourage someone to take on the role of note taker, and that same person to do some share back, because we will be coming back into the space and sharing some of the stuff that we heard from the breakout rooms, and that is very intentional. We know that it's not necessarily easy for people to speak in this large group setting. So if you're comfortable speaking in the smaller group setting and have a colleague who can take on the share back, we want to be able to build in that support. But yeah, we're just going to take 5 minutes. Victoria's going to throw on some more music. Thank you, Victoria. And then we'll queue you up and give you some reminders before we send you into the breakouts. So thank you everyone for taking the time. And yeah, I just want to make space. We had 8 different breakout rooms. So we can just start with, I'm going to go by numbers, and you can say pass. You can definitely pass. If you want to add in the chat, that is okay too, but I'm going to call by numbers to move us over to our break after this. So room 1, did you have anything that you wanted to jump in and share? That was Astrid and Sadie.
Hey, thanks for that, because I couldn't remember what room we're in. Okay, I was the note taker, so I'm going to do as good of a job as I can, but I know that my teammates will jump in. Okay, so we are right. Okay, so we had one person in our team. Her identity is an African-American, older female, tons of lived experience, experiencing the post-traumatic stress of racial trauma. Now currently in the recovery phase, which is both a source of immense power, as you can imagine, but also a place where oftentimes it holds me back, right? It's a lot of heaviness, but also a tremendous place of power. Oftentimes being the token invited in, we need to have a meeting, we need to have this, and this person's oftentimes called in, not only because of who she is, but of course, because of the identities that she covers as a parent, as an older woman, as a female, as an African-American woman, as a resident, etc. However, oftentimes people don't assume, or might assume, that she doesn't have a voice. And when that voice comes out, that's when the power is shown. So there's this beautiful balance in that. Must speak the truth, even though it can cause anxiety from within. So the truth speaker oftentimes might feel, uh-oh, what if I say this? How will it impact people? But of course, the tremendous amount of power is always there. Then the second person, so that was Daleen, and Sadie said, yeah, I'm that, that's all, yep, that, everything that you said. And the observation that previous generations did what they had to do that was necessary to survive. And that there was respect given there to the prior generations upon whose shoulders we stand. Sadie also said that feeling aged, I kind of see this like old soul moment, right? You know, that there's been a lot of life lived, a lot of energy, a lot of just, how do I carry on this mission here? That the awareness of oppressive systems and who is affected, especially at an early age, and what impact does that have on kids? And who do they grow into? Especially if that impact is never addressed in ways that is healing. And I'm putting my own words in. I apologize, Sadie, if I'm misspeaking for you. Okay. So the challenge is with bringing lived experiences into work is that sometimes programming is decided by a mixed group of deciders that includes folks of color and white folks. And in action, it doesn't come. So an example was given. We know that vitamin D deficiency is important, so we want to talk to people about that. But when it's in action, is that the clients of color, patients of color, oftentimes by the white clinicians or service providers, they're not reminded of the vitamin D issue to be a part of their healing process. So there's a lot of talk, but the action doesn't match the agreement, the talk. So that's over and over again, and there's a pattern in that. And then the other piece was that unhoused children's needs are oftentimes ignored. Their particular needs, the expectations are the same. You're a student in this class, but when you're unhoused and you don't get the supports that you're not going to be, that you have unique needs that must be addressed, and those are often ignored because of classism and all the isms and discrimination and biases.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a lot. We know that we have a bunch of questions. We're glad. It sounds like and seems like the conversations were really active. Appreciate the vulnerability and all the depth that was just shared. Just because we're short on time and we don't want to do the injustice of not giving people to go into depth, if we could, for the next few breakout rooms, or next few report backs, really just like keep it to some like shorter reflections, just to make sure that we can hear from every room before we go on to break. Does that feel okay for folks? And you, okay, awesome. So room 2, Marie Sranum.
I have shared in the chat. Thank you.
Oh, you just dropped it in. Thank you so much. Okay, folks, please take a read over there, just for the sake of time. Room 3, Ashley, Olga, Rachel.
Hi, I was the note taker for our room. So real quickly, just to briefly summarize the really great conversations that we had. Someone brought up working in the equity field has brought a lot of personal experience for them. Being an immigrant themselves, they're able to put themselves in sort of the shoes of the folks that they work with, and they're able to help them understand the barriers that they face and the challenges because they've gone through them themselves. So they're able to really help the folks that they work with. They used a really interesting phrase, patent pending, of being born twice, of the place of your birthplace, and then coming into the US as well. So that kind of helps them navigate that. Sort of on the other side of that, someone else shared really quickly about having sort of an ambiguous nationality growing up and people making assumptions based on that. So in your day-to-day, trying really hard to not assume what someone's been through, how they grew up, even how their day was, and it lets them, you learn about them instead of you putting your assumptions on them.
Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. I'm so sorry, folks. We are a little tight on time. Erica, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, the instead of going through all 8 groups, I'm also reflecting on this piece of, we shared some of our identities, we shared who we are and what we bring. And I'm also curious if any groups talked about challenges that they've experienced when navigating. And so right now, I just want to open the space to see if there's a few folks who might share challenges that came up and how they've navigated some of those challenges as you're thinking about your personal and lived experience. Rachel, I saw you unmute. Anything you want to share?
Okay. My connection's bad, so I don't know if you can hear me, but we talked about hiring challenges and requirements for certain academic requirements and how that poses challenges for maybe getting folks with lived experience to do the work. Although, in Massachusetts, we're trying to change that with more skills-based hiring practices. There's just a executive order for that, but it definitely has been, it is a barrier to getting folks experience, but not the academics to do the work. So we did discuss that.
Great, Rachel, thank you. Anyone else want to share some challenges that they've navigated and maybe some advice?
So we are group 6, we talked about challenges, dealing with people's bias, having decision makers who are biased, not being able to trust that things aren't, that interpretations aren't bias laden, the value, placing value on lived experience versus paper, academia, privilege, and some good experiences by inviting people to the table, the right people to the table, and then identifying opportunities for people with lived experience to continue their professional growth within an agency and in multiple ways.
Thank you, Nancy. That was great. Anyone else want to share? I know I'm standing between you and your break, but these are such great comments, and I encourage you to check out the chat too. A lot of folks are adding about some of the points they're seeing, some of the restrictions that they're working under. Lillian, looks like you would like to share.
I just wanted to add on to what Rachel said, and I think the first question I asked is the barrier with us? If you haven't lived the experience of the people that you're serving, do you even have it on your radar to incorporate their lived experience and the whatever? Maybe if you just haven't lived it, it's just not something that comes naturally for you to actually incorporate their get their input to help you with your policies and things like that. So I wonder, like, it's might be easy to say, oh, the organization has these barriers and maybe it's very difficult to use, but I wonder whether it's us. And me and her, we're talking from a bureaucratic level. We work at the state level where we do all this, we contract with vendors, we license people and things like that. So we're not touching the actual people that we're serving, even when these people are within our communities. So substance addiction, your brother is a person with substance addiction, your aunt, your mom, and all those things. But what is the problem? Why is it that I can appreciate that, but where I'm at, I'm struggling to do that because in my family, I might be the person who hasn't lived that experience. So I'm wondering what's going on there and a lot of us who have not lived the experience are the ones who are the decision makers. A lot of us. And so the question, I flipped back and I said, does that mean that people with not lived experience are we the problem, or is there a way for us to actually do this even though we do not have the lived experience? Because I can almost see that not a lot of us have lived experience.
Yeah. So
how is it that we're able to do this work, continue doing it, maybe not so well? So just something to think about.
Yeah, that's such a powerful reflection, Lillian. And I see like a lot of nods, a lot of emojis. You're absolutely right. Like as leaders, I think step one that we need to take is that interrogation and that having that honest conversation about ourselves. What are we bringing? What are we not bringing? And in those spaces where we don't have the lived experience or the close proximity to someone close to us who is experiencing that, what are the actions that we're taking, even small ones, right? Because those small actions have ripples all throughout. And what is our responsibility to make that up? So really thank you and appreciate those reflections from folks. I want to give you a break. There's been a lot of great engagement and it's time to take a break. So Demetrius, I'm going to pass it to you. We're going to have 10 minutes for you to take care of yourselves. Do what you got to do. Demetrius, go ahead.
Yeah, don't want to keep you from it. It's going to be 10 minutes. And when we say break, we truly mean break. That means stepping away from your computer, getting yourself some water, maybe it's a snack. I know this feels stressful sometimes. You need to get work done, but please don't start responding to emails during these 10 minutes. Please take a true break. Okay, it's really important. And we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Before we get back into the content, Rachel, thank you so much. For folks who haven't seen it yet, Rachel put a very cool tool that they use. Would you like to say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I work at a local health department, and certified health departments have to go through community health improvement planning every 5 years or so. And one of the frameworks that you can utilize for that is mobilizing through action, through planning and partnerships, which is a framework created by NACCHO, a lot of acronyms in public health. National Association of City and County Health Officials are a really awesome organization that we get grants from and these kind of tools. So This tool was provided by them, and we used it to make sure that we were inviting as many community organizations and public community members to community health sessions. So that's a tool we used, and I thought it was really helpful because Lillian's comment really reminded me of that, because Lillian's absolutely right. You know, if you're not experiencing those lived experience, you know, it's a blind spot for you. So that toolkit helped us to hopefully avoid that in our county.
Thank you so much for sharing. We love tools. Drop others if you know any. This is super helpful to just hear and see what folks are doing in their fields, in their sector. So continue to use the chat. Go ahead, Demetrius. Sorry about that.
No apologies necessary. That was great. Thank you so much, Rachel, for dropping that into the chat. Others, please feel encouraged to also drop stuff into the chat. That's we're all teachers and all learners piece of these ways of being. And we're going to be going through a whole bunch of tools in like the next section. Before we do, there's going to be a little bit more content. And the next slide has another quick piece of recap for folks. Just on the shared language. I'm not going to read it, but just want to throw it back up here as a reminder for folks as far as the definitions that we were using from the start of the session. And we'll give it a few seconds and pass it to Erica.
Thank you. We're in the next slide. We just wanted to share how Health Resources in Action, our organization, has been thinking about equity work, lived experience, and how it informs our work. And this visual here is just kind of a DNA of how we are thinking of both our internal approaches and our external approaches. We're 3 ways in which we really think about centering lived experience. What does equity mean to us is by challenging, right? First, challenging the assumptions and narratives that we each bring to this space. It reminds me of Lillian's comment about just being aware and what happens when we're not the ones with the lived experience, but we're trying to channel that, and being able to challenge our assumptions about what promotes and hinders health is critical. Then it's the engagement piece, right? Rachel put in the chat a really great tool, but really thinking about how are we creating and sustaining authentic and diverse engagement. And lastly, building. We also want to build together and strengthen the capacity to correct any power imbalances that we're recognizing. And so we do this internally and externally at HRIA. But what I want to mention is that you have to do the internal stuff first, right? Before we go out into the world of how we're doing this work, we need to know how it's showing up for us individually and internally within our organizations. So on the next slide, just some tactics up front, some more overview, high level things of some of the things that we think about. And it's investing the time up front and encouraging that pause. We've talked about that a little bit, and the practitioner Yolo Akili Robinson talks about sacred pauses a lot in their work. And really thinking about as leaders, how are we showing up and creating those spaces to pause and encouraging that, especially up front. We miss that so much in our project work and our programs where we're just starting because we got to get the work done. But as leaders, really showing up, encouraging that pause and pushing back, even if it's just for a moment, to say, wait, this is an opportunity for us to pause. It's an opportunity for us to be intentional. And the way we do that is really thinking about defining our influence and recognizing our power. You can use that power wheel to start, but there's also that piece of the systems that we're swimming in, the power over us. And it's important to name those as a team to be able to define a little bit about where we're coming from, but also the water that we're swimming in. And then thinking about that internal work, I heard it in the chat, I heard it in some of the comments, but where is our ability to make shifts, even if they're small? To be able to promote this work. And we can do that through hiring when we can. I know that some of us are working under constraints. And also our budget, right? Really thinking about how money is coming in and coming out. In our annual review process, we're going to share a little bit about how we're doing, but those internal policies of what are we actually doing, what's on paper in our organization, and how are we living that out as leaders. And to do all of this, the behind the scenes work is so critical. And there's a piece about showing up as a leader that's about humility and the continuous self-reflection. And you all are taking this training and you might read books on it, but really this is like a practice that you are doing throughout your whole career of self-interrogating, self-reflection. And we think about just the ways in how we're forming our teams, who's at the table and who's not at the table, and why aren't they at the table? And then lastly, meeting people where they're at. We know equity work is a long journey, and so being able to have grace with folks, meet them where they're at, and get onto that common understanding are some of the high-level tactics that we used. And so now on the next slide, I'm going to share some specifics of how we're trying things on at HRIA, knowing that our contexts are very different than yours, and some of these may not fit. And in full transparency, we're trying and we're failing and we're succeeding, and it's a long and winding road, but we're committed to continuing to try certain things. And I'm curious to hear how you folks live this out in your work too. But a few that we want to highlight of where we're integrating lived experience is our recruitment and hiring practices. And what that's looked like within HRIA is shifting our job descriptions a little bit. Making sure that relevant and lived experience is a candidate qualification where we can. Sometimes we don't have control about our job descriptions, but we do like having it there so that folks know that we're welcoming folks, degrees or not, or whatever it is, that we're valuing lived experience as much as the formal experience. Another way we do that is by sending questions in advance. And that's a small practice that some folks don't like to do. I don't know for what reason, but a small tweak like that of being able to have folks and know that there's different learning styles, different processing times. Sending those questions in advance has really helped us kind of expand the pool, make sure we're being accessible, and letting folks, giving them a moment to pause and think of those responses. I see in the chat that some of the bureaus have started sending questions in advance, and that's like a really easy practice to try to shift within your context. The other piece is we're trying out some interview questions. So when we send them in advance, we also want to be explicit about our commitment to lived experience, and these are optional questions. So we want to tell the participants, here's what we want to ask you. If you would like to share, we would also love to know what your lived experience you're bringing to this role, inviting them to be able to share that piece of vulnerability, but really being able to see their level of thinking related across race, culture, gender, class. And again, that's an optional question, but it just commits and it shows that we're explicitly looking at these types of things in our work. And then lastly, in our annual performance reviews. This is an optional section that we have started piloting last year within HRIA so that staff can intentionally discuss how their lived experiences support and advance their work. This is newer and it's a lot trickier. There was no models for us to follow, but we really thought if we want to walk the talk and we're saying that this is important to us, then we wanted to, again, create that space for folks to be able to reflect on it, share with their supervisors, and have like a formal recognition of the lived experience that's seen or unseen and how it's relating to their work. So those are just a few. Demetrius, do you want to add anything before we go into some of the other examples we have? Anything there from you, Demetrius?
Hi, sorry about that, folks. Internet connection is a little unstable. It just blew really hard, strong winds. Erica, that was great. I don't have anything to add.
All right. I see in the chat too, some folks are trying these on. There is no right or wrong answer. Absolutely, Lillian. Different processing times. Yep. Yeah, and these are ways that you can really show up in small ways and in bigger ways, right? Our practices hopefully will then become policies that we see more formalized. And Lillian, I want to give you space. I see your hand raised.
I just wanted to emphasize that word because it was the best thing that happened for me when I was interviewed. When people ask you, talk about your lived experience, and they use all these very interesting words, you know, disparities and inequities, a lot of people are really intimidated by anything to do with describing those things, even when they are very sure. So that language, I think, scares a lot of people because they feel like if they don't say it well, that means they do not understand inequities, disparities, and all this stuff that's very good for people with graduate degrees to say.
Yeah.
Once you say it very, I guess from a place of kindness, like, we would love to hear this. You know, there's no wrong or right answer. Like, and then people start to loosen up, and then you start to hear the genuine answer of lived experience. And so for me, that was the best thing that happened to me in an interview, especially with a question around this particular subject.
Right. Thank you so much, Lillian. Great points. Do apply this to any position, Diane asked. It's not perfect, Diane. We're really trying, you know, in our job descriptions, all of our different teams make our different job descriptions, but there's things that we're committing to in terms of adding it in our job descriptions, being clear about salary transparency, and sending questions in advance so that the accessibility is there, different processing times is there, and we're not perfect, but we are certainly trying things on. So if you have the answer for how to do this well in your organization, I want to invite you to share anything before Demetrius gets into some specifics around some of the things we're trying on this coming year. All right, Demetrius, passing it to you.
Thanks, Erica. So we can go to the next slide. In this section, we're coming back to power. And so we're really looking especially at the role of like some of these values: authenticity, inclusivity, and effectiveness. But in particular, authenticity in this next section. Does anyone feel comfortable coming off mute and reading this quote? Any brave volunteers?
I'm happy to. Right. Authenticity isn't about being the real me, but being true to our purpose and values that drive us.
Thank you, Sophie. Appreciate that. So yeah, authenticity being about purpose and values. And this quote, and one of the reasons it really speaks to me is because of the varied perspectives. Like, I feel like authenticity is one of those things that a lot of cultures and organizations have been talking about for years now. And it sometimes is equated to vulnerability. And the two aren't quite the same. Right? So vulnerability can sometimes feel like an invitation, which is extraordinary, kind, and it takes a lot to be able to hold that in an organization and in like a workspace. And it can sometimes feel exploitative. It can sometimes feel re-traumatizing for folks. And so there are a few different approaches. But even if we're choosing, for whatever reason, based on whatever space we have to give of ourselves in any given day, we can still be authentic. We can still hold our purpose and our values and move through the workspace and move through our work with communities with those purpose and values centered, regardless of how comfortable we feel being vulnerable in any given moment. And I feel like that's really important as we move into this next section. It goes back to the different types of power we talked about. Authenticity is really talking about that power within. Right. It goes back to like the positive like affirmations and appreciations for ourselves even. Right. It's really about the core of our purpose and values and being able to like hold that at the center of our work. Eric, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that before we move into. No. Awesome. Thank you. So we can go into the next slide. So these next few slides, we're really not going to dive in too much, but it is specifically about one of the things we're trying on and have been trying on at HRIA for a few years. And they're called racial justice affinity groups. These spaces are popping up in a few different types of models in a few different types of ways. So some folks here might feel familiar with them. Just really briefly at HRA, what it means for us. In RJAG, we're really taking time to recognize the link between our heart and our body in processing experiences of racism and practicing dismantling white supremacy culture. And so at HRA, we have two different like groups. There's a white cohort, and then there's a person of color cohort with multiple groups within, right? We are very intentional about keeping them small enough that they can feel intimate and you can really connect with people over a course of a few months. So just giving that context really quickly. And so in those spaces, we are making space for people to process things that you wouldn't normally talk about in a workspace. We're going to talk about it a little bit more later on, but we really have this value at HRA about making both space for the head, that like intellectual stuff, right? Like so many folks in public health come from like academic backgrounds or work in like state institutions, right? So it's very heady headspace, but we also want to make a lot of more space for the heart. That's a space that needs a lot more intention to be made as well, because it's not currently part of the broader work culture, but we think it's absolutely critical for folks to be able to feel like they can show up fully. Erica just threw a really great question into the chat. Just really quick, like show of hands with some emojis, or maybe just dropping a response into the chat. Have anyone here ever participated in affinity groups, whether it's been in your actual organizations or even in your communities? I'm seeing a bunch of thumbs up. So I'm seeing a few people on camera raising their hands. I see a comment in the chat about keep trying, but not enough buy-in from leadership or employees. And that's really big. That's really big. That's part of the conversation that we're having here today too, right? It's about how can we take our power that we all have. Erica, I know you were part of the process in building the buy-in at HRA a few years back. Do you want to speak to this a bit?
Yeah, and there was a comment in the chat about not allowing threats of lawsuits, and I just want to recognize that this is real. Like, depending on where you're working and the context that you're in, this might not be a tool that you can try on. But ways that we've got around that is, instead of doing like racial justice affinity groups, sometimes we have spaces, processing spaces that folks can opt into, or we have informal spaces by level or tenure within our organization where people can just talk, they can troubleshoot, they can practice some of the tools or some of the issues that they're coming into without having that hierarchical power dynamics in the space. And so whether it's by level, by tenure, we're taking the racial justice affinity groups because we know that those processing spaces don't exist and could be helpful for our staff. But we also know that that's not a possibility in a lot of spaces. And so how can we reframe the idea of holding space for authenticity the way we're doing in our RJAG groups in other ways within your organization that may be better heard from your leadership? And so a piece of that is figuring out what's the messaging that we need to communicate of the value of these spaces, and then figuring out how to do so in a way that's not going to get you a threat of lawsuit, Taryn, right? Is that by level? Is it affinity in different spaces? Is it by tenure? But the important takeaway is, where are we making space for our people to process, to practice, and to connect with their hearts more?
Thanks, Erica. That's a really important piece of the conversation. I know that please keep it coming in the chat. We're going to move forward in the slides a little bit. I saw a question in the chat earlier. Are we getting the slides? Yes, you're getting the slides. You're getting the recording. I'm not going to read these quotes right now, but Eric and I talked, and we really want to include some other voices from HRA. So these are some quotes and reflections on what the RJAG space meant to folks who participated in it this past program cycle. So please come back to that. And then we're going to be talking very briefly about a few different strategies for incorporating lived experience a little bit more. So we can go into the next slide. And this is going back to how RJAG played a role in one of our annual trainings. So we have this annual supervising across difference training. It's really introducing new supervisors to the space of HRA and how we go about supervising and how we go about managing. And this is just to show you all a little bit of like the value add of RJAG and how it's not just a space that impacts people within it, but how the learnings from that space then go on to inform other policies and practices within HRA. So on the next slide, Really quick case scenario. I won't read through these, but the context setting for you all to come back to these when you get the slides later on for the before and after. Before, that was the scenario that appeared in one of our supervising cross difference trainings that folks in the training then debriefed. It came from a supervisor at HRIA. There's a composite, right, of different feedback and questions that came through. And we used it in that training to kind of process how would we support the supervisee being discussed in like the mini case study. But going back to a conversation from the start of this training, we saw that it had a little bit of like a deficit focus. And we, in the RJAG space, then reflected on it. There were a few of us in my RJAG cohort who also attended the training. We saw the case study and we talked about how it didn't quite sit right with us. So we processed it in that RJAG space and we reframed it. And we swapped it over to an asset focus. And we are talking about how we as supervisors not only have the power and the space, but also like the responsibility to support our supervisees. So really encourage you to take a look at these and like the kind of the frame shift that happened as a result when you get these slides. Really helpful example. And then take that and kind of like let it inform your own case studies and examples that you use in your own trainings. And then just really quick, sorry, we are a little tight on time, so I'm not going to go through this too much, but a very practical example around the diversity of teams. So one of the teams that I'm on is the Massachusetts COVID Community Grants Program. We're doing a lot of work with community organizations across the state of Massachusetts. And I'm familiar with some organizations in this space. Some of you are in that program even. But the value piece here about trusting relationships being built by people and the intentionality of the design of those teams. So going back to what Erica was saying about our hiring practices and getting a lot of diverse folks onto teams. It's not just to have diversity for diversity's sake. It's because having people with so varied approaches and experiences from their life then informs the program and it does work with all the other organizations we partner with in extraordinary ways. So we build trusting relationships. And then because we now have, for example, an Indigenous woman who is a member of a tribal state organization here in Massachusetts, she is our consultant. And the person who works with all the tribal and Indigenous people serving organizations in the program. Someone else on the team, for example, he's a Black man, he's young, and he's working with an organization out in Western Massachusetts that focuses specifically on the health of men of color. And so those are just some really brief practical examples, kind of connecting the dots. And I'll pass it to Erica for a little additional on this.
Yeah, the last piece I'll add is the piece of tokenization came up earlier of like, how are we doing this in a way that like, I'm not the resident, Latina who's going to work with all the Latina serving organizations, right? And that's a strategy to be able to build those trusting relationships. And as leaders, we need to make sure that it's not the piece of, we're not tokenizing anybody. We're realizing that their lived experience makes them the best person to be able to interact with all of their bringing, all of their experiences. And we need to do so in a way that's respectful and has dignity for everyone. And we need to be constantly asking ourselves, again, who's not at this table? Why are they not at this table? And start thinking as a team and be able to explicitly share that with each other of where are some of our shortcomings? If we're going to be adding folks to our team to make them diverse, how are we supporting them? Making sure they don't feel tokenized and making sure that their lived experience is able to inform their work and really give them the capacity to do the work well. So that's the last thing I'll add to that piece, that a lot of it comes from like continuous learning, trying things on, and the accountability piece of ourselves as individuals and to our team members of leading with humility. And more importantly, you're going to make mistakes in this work. And as a leader, it's so key to admit when mistakes are made, to be able to show that transparency, but it's important to be trying things on. However small, however big, you're going to fail. You're going to succeed, but being that leader committed to continuous learning and accountability will help with these pieces. All right, next slide. All right, we're about to transition to the next section. This is just a quick little break. So now we're going to start thinking about building power within our organizations. Demetrius, you want to take it over?
Yeah, thanks, Erica. Really appreciate the nice little stretch. So in this section, we're going to introduce a bunch of different tools. And I really do mean introduce. We're not going to go into any of them with a lot of depth, but we know some trainings will sometimes introduce one or two tools, explore them kind of shallowly. And sometimes you walk away from those trainings feeling like, well, it was nice, but didn't quite feel right. So the approach that Eric and I decided to take was to introduce you to a few more tools than normal and really just giving you all a little bit of like a taste of ideas so you can take them back, really take some time to reflect, and then you can feel free to contact us or do some more follow-up and research on your own to look into these. But we want to explore a few of them and hopefully have enough time to talk a little bit about the peer supervision model as well. So on the next slide, we just kind of listing really briefly the tools that we're going to be highlighting. So ways of being, asking, listening, informing, care, and then head and heart space. Ways of being. Y'all have seen this slide. Please know if it's not already part of your practice, this is important. It's not just a way to kind of like open a space. It's foundational to the culture of a space and the culture from in between spaces as well. So if you're having a training or a big meeting within your organizations, these ways of being aren't only there during that meeting, they also exist in between. Just really want to highlight that it is a tool available to all of us to make space for courageous conversation and kind of like help us feel a little bit more comfortable on how we move through those spaces. Ask, listen, inform. There are a few slides on this one. There are a lot of examples on the other slides. We're really just going to take a little bit of time. It's a motivational interviewing practice. So when I say open-ended questions, for example, I'm going to be asking someone an open-ended question, then I'm going to listen, and then maybe inform, maybe not. But when I say open-ended questions, what does that mean for folks? You can feel free to come off mute, drop some in the chat. Yeah, so open-ended questions are not going to have any yes or no answers. Thanks for dropping that in the chat. So an open-ended question, we can go to the next slide. Some examples will be like, how have things been going? Maybe it's not necessarily in the form of a question. It might be a little bit more like, interesting, tell me more. These are all really designed to make space for the person you're in communication with or the people you're in communication with to really expand and open up. Asking is really about giving them spaces. It's not about us doing the talking and taking a bunch of time asking. I'm not asking like 5 questions in a row and then giving people a little bit of time to respond to each of them briefly. I'm asking questions and then I'm really making space for them to share. An important thing is that sometimes a question might feel open, but actually be kind of closed. So an example of that would be, are you doing well today? It's very easy for someone to respond yes or no to that, and then just kind of move on. Particularly easy to say yes. No is a little tougher, but it's particularly easy for someone to say, yeah, I'm doing great. And even though it wasn't necessarily a yes or no response, and it wasn't necessarily a question that limited a person to a yes or no response, it wasn't quite as open. And so just being really intentional with the way that we move about conversations and in our spaces to make space for the other people we're in community with. And then the important piece, if you're going to ask, you have to listen. So on the next slide, we have just a few quick tips around active listening. Would also be excited to have folks add additional active listening tips in the chat. Again, you all are going to be getting these slides. We really just want to introduce this tool. And it's like a really quick framework in your mind. Like if you know you're headed into a difficult conversation, you can just think to yourself, ALI, ask, listen, inform, and then kind of use them as quick reminders on how you want to hold that conversation in that space. So, active listening tips. And then the last piece is informing. And this is just the piece about closing the loop, right? And so if you are asking and then you're listening, every now and then, not all the time, but every now and then, you might need to inform as part of the response, right? In the process of listening, things might come up that need to continue conversationally. Especially as like a supervisor and as a manager, a lot of times I might ask how someone is experiencing a space or if they're struggling with the tasks. And they can share with me what they're going through and what struggles or what challenges or what successes they're having. And then my role, I then move into a space where I can like kind of help coach them, kind of help guide them, or maybe I'm just affirming them, right? So there are a few different like linguistic examples here to kind of help folks along. One option, another option, taking that kind of an approach, really kind of guiding folks if you're more in a mentorship type position. But also in that last point about acknowledging that decisions are theirs to make. If they are theirs to make, you really want to empower folks, remind them of what their power looks like in a conversation and in a process. And really just kind of affirm them. And like, if you are saying that the decision is theirs to make, and you trust them and they're empowered to do so, just affirming the decision that they do then make is also really powerful and important. I know that was really quick. Again, we're just kind of like jumping through these tools. Erica, did you have anything that you wanted to add to this piece?
No, my big takeaway here is, we talk about courageous conversations as a power building tool, and you may use these, you may know about them, but the piece we wanted to emphasize here is that courageous conversations are a piece of power that we have the ability to enact within our organizations, even if it's just me and my colleague or me and my supervisor. The more we're practicing these types of tools, the more it becomes easier to do it as we're thinking organizationally, population health wise. And so I just wanted to tie that back, Demetrius, that courageous conversations are a power building tool. And here's just some frames that you can use. I wanted to drop in the chat a link to the Black Emotional and Mental Health Collective. Have folks heard of this? Amazing body of work. This group is incredible. And in the chat that I dropped in a link to some of their free wellness tools. One of them is thinking about a process for conflict management. And so in this work, while we're having courageous conversations, we're going to have conflict. And so how do we think about it? We just did ask, listen, inform. And another tool to try on when we experience conflict is the care model. And what that looks like is I'm going to remind myself as a supervisor, I need to care. I need to care. There's tension here and care. So C is for confronting the challenge straight up, right? We want to be forthcoming about it and explicitly name and address how our different identities are showing up and how our lived experience maybe operating in that space. But the important piece about confronting is being able to speak your truth and approach conflict as an opportunity for learning and connection. The A for affirm, as Demetrius said, like affirming and validating experiences is so key as a supervisor and as a leader, but even just as a colleague. So after you're confronting, you want to affirm your colleague and create a timeline to address the situation. You also want to revisit those pieces, revisit the plan, revisit the timeline with the collective consistency, excuse me, so that you can ensure accountability, because that's a big piece of this. And then lastly, engaging in a collective evolution, knowing that we're all going to be in conflict with each other, but when the conflict is resolved, we're agreeing to move forward. So we're just trying to give you these tips, these acronyms, these frameworks, and I encourage you to check out Beam's community wellness tools. They have a huge repository of journal prompts, different media, different trainings to think of, and this is just one of the process for conflict management. Demetrius, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Erica. So just going back to the head and heart piece that we were talking about earlier, acknowledging that in our team meeting spaces, for example, we can make space for both. You don't need to necessarily have two separate meetings, one meeting that's just head, one meeting that's just heart. You can have those blended spaces. And so a way about doing that is checking in That's one of the things that we did right at the top of the meeting. We like asked how folks were doing, and then we moved into the breakout rooms and we gave ourselves appreciations, right? Icebreaker questions that are like truly meaningful, not just like what's your favorite color, are another nice way of going about this. And then appreciations, and these don't have to be appreciations for yourselves, and that alone. I know that already feels somewhat radical. We can also share appreciations to our teammates and our colleagues. And so being able to add those types of things into something like a team meeting is a really great way to start blending between the head and the heart in one space. That way you have both the intellectual investment and the emotional investment. And it's something that we are continuously doing. To Eric's point earlier about like the job descriptions, for example, different teams, different spaces in HRIA do it to varying extents. But we're trying entirely as an organization to move more in that direction. This next piece, I'm going to go over it in very briefly, but it's an example of a blended space, and that's peer supervision. Just really quickly, what does that mean compared to other types of supervision? So in a traditional like supervisor-supervisee relationship, that's like a one-to-one. In a group supervision space, maybe this is like a director working with their team. That would be like a one-to-many. In peer supervision, we're really looking at a many-to-many approach. Erica dropped a question into the chat. I would love to hear some responses to that as well if folks here are using peer supervision models. So feel free to drop some responses in the chat. But what that looks like on my team, for example, we have this team of technical assistants. And we're all doing the same work. And in a team meeting, maybe we're talking a little bit more about deadlines, when reports are due, and all those things. In this peer supervision space, though, it's a moment to like sit down, take a breath, and say, everyone, I'm stressed. I don't know what to do about this. And it really just like opens up space. And it's an opportunity to share with your colleagues, right? In a slightly different way than it is to just share with your supervisor. It opens up a lot more space for conversation, for collaboration. And it's a really great opportunity to build up folks on your team, especially folks who might not be supervisors. Sometimes when you're becoming a supervisor, you're becoming a manager, you're kind of thrown into it, and then you start learning those skills for the very first time. Peer supervision spaces are really great for folks who are new to that, who are not yet in those positions, to also build up their skills in how they can support their colleagues. So that was really quick. There's another slide right after this. It's just a really quick quote from someone who participates in one of those spaces, but really the important pieces and the takeaways and how this connects in some ways to the other pieces of courageous conversations that we're talking about. It's a very flexible space. It can hold so many different types of conversations and so many different topics. And it really embraces the fact that everyone has very lived experience. And so in that like group model of like one to many, you're really relying on the lived experience of that person who's in the traditionally highest position of power most of the time. And in the peer supervision model, you're embracing the lived experience of every person in that community who's engaging in the space. Seeing some stuff in the chat. Wondering if there's another term for supervision. It can be flexible. The model comes from social work. Erica, I see that you came off mute. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I just wanted to uplift the comments on that as the supervision. Daleen, I wondered if you could speak into this space if you feel comfortable about some of the advice or tips you learned from leading this work in your organization. All right, nothing to add to that, Demetrius.
Daleen, I see you trying to unmute, I think. I think you're on the phone. Okay, if you can unmute, please do. And if you're struggling, it's okay. We'll
Okay,
talk.
there it is. Somebody unmuted me.
Yeah.
I was speaking to the courageous conversations. One of the aspects of my job that I appreciate the most is being able to co-facilitate. We have what's called the Lift and Learn Lift leadership team, and everybody in the agency is invited to be a part of that committee, and we tackle issues that are relevant to the communities that we serve, as well as our agency. For example, this month, we're going to be tackling immigration myths and realities. So we've invited a local agency that provides support to immigrants to come and speak. We usually start out with a video or a song that's relevant to the topic. And then we have a unity agreement that we read that keeps everybody in check. And then we have our discussion group. And we've been really fortunate that with the unity agreement, everyone knows what they're getting into so that we can tackle some pretty tough conversations. We have some pretty, it can be a triggering for some people, but uplifting for others, and definitely eye-opening. So it's, like I said, one of the aspects of my job that I'm most happy to be able to be a part of. And I just want to say that as far as our name, the Listen, Learn, Lift team, is because when we first created this from our job, my son, we've been doing this for about 4 years now. And so he was probably about 23, was walking by, and we were just trying to figure out, okay, well, what is it we want to do? He says in the background, sounds to me like you folks are trying to listen to the youth, lift up their voices, and learn from them. I said, oh, listen, learn, lift. Okay, thanks, kids.
Wow.
So that's the idea behind it, is to listen to the voices, learn from the voices that are present, and lift up and lift these voices, especially the youth that we work with.
I really love the idea of a unity agreement.
Yes,
See what that
real
looks
important.
like. Yeah.
That's so important. You can't run this without a unity agreement.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing. And it
Thanks.
reminds me, for the piece on lived experience, we often ask ourselves, like, why does it even matter? And what I want to share with folks is that we're all working with limited resources, right? Limited money, finances, staffing, program. And we know that those closest to the pain need to be closest to the power to be able to enact those changes, because it works better. And we've seen that in various examples throughout our work, and I'm sure you've seen it in your work. But when we're able to center folks with lived experience, when we're thinking about power, we're able to most effectively use the limited resources that we already have. Just thinking about the disability justice movement and their work of nothing for us without us, right? If you want the buy-in there, if you want your interventions or your programs to be effective, this is the reason why, and this is where you do it. By really having folks who are the closest to the pain, be closest to the problem, so that our interventions and our programs can be as effective as possible. Any other thoughts, Demetrius?
No, nothing to add. You're wonderful. You're incredible. Everyone attending is wonderful and incredible, adding a lot of great stuff to the chat. Thank you, everyone, for the engagement. We know that we just sped through these tools. Again, we really just want to take some time to introduce them, but then pass them to you so you can take some time to reflect, think through what you want to explore a little bit more. But please know we're happy. Please reach out to us. We have a little bit more content today, but please reach out to us if you have additional questions and follow up about any of the tools specifically, or even in general. And hope that you have some really great conversations with your teams about them and get to use them. So I'm going to pass to Erica now for the final section of the training today.
This will be the last tool we present to you. And we were thinking about some of the registration pieces. And a lot of folks ask, what are the strategies to communicate those in power? How do I know who has power, who doesn't? And so we wanted to pull a tool from community organizing about actor mapping, power mapping, it's sometimes called. And so on the next slide, first, the strategies to communicate with those in power. 4 tips that we've seen work really well that we get from that community organizing lens is the data and stories, right? When you're coming to somebody with a lot of formal authority, a lot of formal power, you need to bring the receipts, right? You need to know what you're talking about. You need to have the data, and you need to bring in that storytelling piece and messaging to be able to have folks hear you. You need to build alliances and know who is it that you're trying to work with, who may be opposed or against, and how are you thinking about their influence. You need to have tailored messaging for each of these folks. And you also sometimes need to leverage external pressures. What that's looked like within HRIA is finding examples and saying, You know, the field is moving this way. We see our colleagues doing it this way. Why aren't we doing it? Sometimes we invite them to speak and say, look at the amazing things they're doing at their organization, and really start putting some of those external pressures. And a good way to do that is find things that you find inspiring, the groups that are doing it, and present it to your leadership or those in power so that you can kind of have those conversations. Here's the data. Here's the message that I need to tell you. And here's the external reason why this is good for us and smart for us. And so one way you can specifically think about building alliance is by using this tool on the next slide called actor mapping and power mapping. Are folks familiar with this? Has anybody seen this before? Okay, I'm going to do the annotation really quickly. So this is a very simple tool. It's a 2x2 grid that you can do on a piece of paper. We've done it on PowerPoints or like whiteboards. You can do it with sticky notes with your teams. But this should be the first kind of piece you're thinking about when you're building alliances, when you're trying to have a goal that you're trying to achieve. You need to figure out where the key influence is, where the power dynamics, who has a lot of influence, who doesn't have influence. And this is one way to do it in a visual way, to analyze who holds power and who holds influence. And so this information, you can plan and strengthen the ways on how you're allocating and advocating for resources. And so what this looks like is, first you want to identify a goal. You want to be clear about what is it that I'm trying to achieve. That could be personally, that can be within your community or within your organization, but you have to be really clear about what is the goal I am trying to complete. The second step is figuring out who are those key actors, who are all of the individuals and the groups, sometimes that's outside your organization, who have a stake in this goal. And that can be like leaders within your organization, your colleagues, your peers, your external funders. And then you want to think about all of those actors and start placing them on this quadrant. And so when I look from left to right, low influence, that might be, and as I come all the way over here to higher influence, really thinking about who are those folks who have that more formal authority, that more formal power or influence, and where do they fall within this line? Do they have a lot of high influence? Are they the CEO or your funder? If so, they would be closer to this right-hand side. If they have lower influence or lower formal authority, they could be here in the lower influence, closer to this line. And then from top to bottom, it's about interest, right? Who has a lot of high interest in my goal or in my the thing that I'm trying to achieve, and they would be higher up on this line. And if they have low interest, then they would be lower on this line. And so I would sit and I would think about all of the individual actors. As an example, my CEO. Well, he has really high influence, so he would be on this side of the quadrant. But he's not that interested in what I want to do. He has low interest. And so his name would go here. Right? And you do that for every single person. Like, who has high interest, or they're really interested in what I want to do, but they might have lower influence. And so I might put them here, Demetrius. And we do that for every actor. And the purpose of this is to really think about who the players are, and as a team, be able to visualize where they fit in terms of how interested they are in what I'm doing and how much power, seen or unseen, they have. And you're trying to figure out, who do you need to move from each of these quadrants to another? Like, maybe my CEO has a lot of power, but he's not really interested in what I'm doing. So as a team, we think about, how do I move him up here? How do I get his interest a little bit higher? So a really important tool to do with your teams, we want to have you practice this a little bit. And this actor mapping, there's a lot of different resources online to do it. But the way we want you to do it today is taking old school. Take a piece of paper, make a 2x2 grid. who has influence, who has interest, put them on paper. And then from that, if we go to the next slide. Oh, how do I delete all this? Sorry, y'all. Sorry, Victoria. And then once I know where people fit in my actor map, I have a better understanding who has low interest that I need to make more interested, who maybe has a lot of interest but doesn't have a lot of power, formal power. And there is no right or wrong way to put folks on these maps, but it really is a tool to then start thinking about this. Okay, now I know where the actors fall on this. Whose interest do I want to foster? Whose interest can I build? And how might I engage them? And then secondly, whose influence do you want to build? And how might I engage them? So this is like a really simple tool, right? To do by yourself or to do with teams. But I really encourage you all, before you embark on a goal that you're trying to center, do this quickly with your team or by yourself to be able to really get a sense of, I'm offering limited resources right now. I want to be able to navigate who and where I need to be putting my energy to. Any questions about that? To honor our introverted folks who need some space to process and take in all of this information, we're going to do an individual activity right now where we're going to have you practice power mapping. And so what I want you to do is, on a piece of paper, I want you to draw a 2x2 grid. And I want you to individually think about an example where you want to make change. So again, thinking about that goal. What is the goal or the change that I'm trying to enact? Then I want you to spend a few times listing out who has stake in the game, who is a partner in this, who is a player that I need to make sure I'm involving, and try to start putting them in the quadrants a little bit to see where do they fall. And how can I visually see who I need to be working on moving in the quadrants as I'm trying to gain their influence or gain their interest. So we are going to have maybe like 10 minutes to do that silently. And then what we're going to do is break you out into small groups just to talk with your colleagues. Each of you are going to have a different goal, but what we really want you to emphasize is like, how do you want to engage people? What are the strategies that have worked well for you when you're trying to get buy-in, when you're trying to get influence from folks to make your goal a reality? And so that's what this next piece is. Some individual thinking, practice the power map. We'll put it back up on the screen for you to see. And any questions, please share right now. Any other thoughts? I'll share that, earlier, somebody dropped in the chat. It can be used to identify other people who could be at the table but aren't considered invited. Exactly, Nancy. And we've really used it as a tool to inform the plan and figure out whose relationship do we need to strengthen. Earlier, I talked about our 360 reviews and incorporating lived experience as a formal piece of how we're, reviewing staff on an annual basis. And I do got to say that wasn't just something that leadership or our organization was like, yeah, let's do it, right? That took a lot of organizing from more junior level staff, especially. Shout outs to my colleagues, Jasper Lee, Ariel, Edward, Michelle, a lot of folks within HRIA who thought about this from an organizing lens, really thinking about who needs to be on board to make this happen. How am I communicating with them? And who has low interest that I can increase their interest in what I'm doing? And so this tool really allows us to visually analyze who already holds power, who already has influence, and who may not, and how am I targeting my efforts into making sure that they're able to participate in the goal I'm trying to achieve. So again, another tool. We've thrown a lot of tools, a lot of frameworks, like Demetrius was saying earlier. We know that your contexts are very different than ours, and we hope to give you just a tour of things that you can try on post-interview, post-training. Demetrius, anything you would add there?
The only thing is also the way that all the tools kind of weave together, right? So some of the tools earlier, especially around like asking, listening, informing, is a really great way to approach a conversation when you are in this like low influence, high interest quadrant, and you're trying to get people to from a low interest, high influence quadrant to a high interest, high influence quadrant. That ask, listen, inform kind of model is really like inviting those people to a conversation to explore the things that are meaningful to you and to other folks in your community, in your organization. And so the different strategies that we kind of explored and like the cultural shift pieces of having head and heart in the same spaces. There are practices that over time increase the space to have some of these other more difficult and really conversations that need that courage. So just the ways that these tools all complement each other too is really important. It goes back to that policy and practice piece. There are practices in play. That's where you bring in the head and the heart. Like having that truly be a practice is the way you can then move forward to change and enact new policies.
Thanks, Demetrius. Astrid, you have your hand raised.
Well, I was just thinking, you know, in our little bubbles, whatever we consider influence or high influence could be different from your bubble and your bubble. So even the word influence or the concept, what does that mean? What does that look like? Who are we talking about? It's maybe not always the same variables that are considered influential.
A really great point, Astrid. And that's why it's so important to do this as a group once you've had time to do it individually, because we find that people have a lot of different assumptions, a lot of different understandings. And sometimes your team is working in a lot of different spaces. And if you don't have a core understanding of who are the partners at the table and who do I need to be thinking about strategically in order to build alliances, to message more effectively, to really think about how to advance this work, you start finding that your resources aren't really being used the way that they could be most effectively. So really encourage folks to use this. We've done it on a large wall with sticky notes at the beginning of a project. We've done it on Zoom where you can annotate. We've done it individually the way we just did it now. And so just all things to try on. And that brings us to the end, our closing. I want to just appreciate you all have been with us for 3 hours on a Sunday. I know we're in different time zones too. Somebody logged in at 7 a.m. Shout out, Angela. Shout out to you and others. The last piece is just a housekeeping piece. The next slide, Victoria. We do offer these trainings for free. We would love if you're able to give us some feedback so we can continue to refine and offer these trainings. And we also want to encourage you for our upcoming April training, where we're going to be talking about structural racism through policy, systems, and environmental change. So we're going to drop those 2 links there for you. I want to make space to see if anyone else has any closing or parting words. Demetrius, anything from you or Victoria?
For me, it's just really big appreciation to everyone who came on a Friday to do a very long training, especially the folks like Erica mentioned who logged in very early in your respective time zones. We know it's a lot, and we know that it's an invitation from us to you to engage in these conversations with us, with your own colleagues within your own organizations. And we just really hope that we gave you a few different approaches and that at least one of them feels right for you. And really encourage you to really take some time to reflect and explore in these.
Thank you all so much. I dropped in my email if folks want to connect. Demetrius, I don't know if you want to do the same, but y'all are awesome. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely Friday, a lovely weekend. And I hope to see you at the next one.